This is the Angry Birds Bird Minute, sponsored by Angry Birds for their 15th anniversary, where we tell you all about a cool bird that may or may not be angry. Today's bird is the megapode. In addition to their awesomely weird name, the megapode is also called the mound builder or the incubator bird because of their habit of incubating their eggs beneath a big pile of decomposing plants. Rather than sitting on their eggs to keep them warm, megapodes carefully add and remove vegetation from their nest throughout the incubation process, maintaining just the right temperature as the compost breaks down. In some species, like the Australian brush turkey, these nests can be huge, dwarfing the size of the birds themselves. Instead of using egg tooths like most chicks, megapode hatchlings use their powerful claws to escape the eggs and then dig their way out of the nest. After hatching, young megapodes are immediately fully capable and independent of their parents. But are they angry? On a scale of 1 to angry, we rate the megapode as composed. Get it? Composted it? This is Wild Green Streams. I'm Rhett.
I'm Io.
And today on the show, we have a fact check. Take it away, Io.
We do. Okay, I'm going to give you a list of 4 things, and you're going to put them in order of which you think came first.
Okay.
Okay, so we've got the North Star, Polaris.
Okay.
We've got the rings of Saturn.
Okay.
We've got trees.
Okay.
Existing.
Sure.
And we have sharks.
Got it.
Which do you think came first to last? Put them in an order.
Okay, I'm going to say Polaris, the North Star. It doesn't have to have been in the north, but like the star itself. The rings of Saturn, trees, sharks.
Well, that is an excellent guess, but in fact, you are incorrect.
Oh, no.
It is actually the inverse.
Really?
So sharks are the oldest, then trees, then Saturn's rings, and then the North Star.
Go on.
So, which, when I first, I was like, there's no way that, so it was like sharks were older than trees. I was like, no. But, foolish of me, life did start in the ocean, so then I'm like, it does kind of like make sense.
I guess so, yeah.
So, sharks first appeared, like the first fossil evidence that we have of them, which, again, maybe they existed early, we don't have fossil evidence, who knows?
Sure.
Sharks, or like their, shark ancestors, date to about 450 million years ago, which is in the late Ordovician period. And so that's 400 to 450 million years ago, which is really, really old. And also, they've stayed pretty unchanged for most of that time. They found a body plan that worked and was like, all right, I'm gonna head out. This is it. They finished their test early, and then they handed it in, and then they got to just leave. They were like, this is fine.
Mm-hmm.
Trees, based on the fossil evidence, they evolved around 400 million years ago. And, plants existed before trees. We had lots of simple plants, but they were non-vascular plants, which is things like mosses and stuff. And the vascularity is like the inner, basically like plant circulatory network is what allowed them to get much bigger and much taller and be more supported. But trees didn't come onto the scene until about 400 million years ago. So there was about 50 million years where sharks existed and there were no trees.
Wow.
And then...
That is such a long time.
50 million years.
That's like almost the difference between dinosaurs and us.
Yeah. That's how long sharks were just like kicking it.
Yeah.
And the Saturn's rings formed similar to kind of trees about 400 million years old, which Saturn, the planet itself, was, existed long before that, but the rings didn't kind of settle, the rings didn't form at the same time. They didn't, Saturn is like 4.5 billion years old, but the rings didn't come in until about 400 million years, since now. So there was a long period of time where it didn't have any rings, which is kind of strange because that's kind of like the characteristic that we associate with Saturn, but it just took much longer for all the dust particles and everything to settle into the rings as we know them today.
Weird to think about, for sure.
Yeah.
Hard to picture it.
And then Polaris, the North Star, is estimated to be only 45 to 67 million years old. So barely emerging onto the scene as the dinosaurs were going extinct.
Wait, so it's possible that no dinosaur that's not a bird saw the North Star?
This is true.
That's crazy.
The North Star could be a post-dinosaur exclusive.
Weird.
And not even just because the position of stars as in their position in the sky, in like the Polaris being the North Star, like they shift over time as the Earth shifts. So there's going to be a time period in the future where Polaris is no longer the North Star because Earth has shifted on its axis and stuff like that. So we're not even talking about it being in its location that it is now. It didn't even exist until...
Gee, that's wild.
So it was like just, bunch of gas, and it was just waiting for time to form. So around 45 to 67 million years ago, so not like relatively young in terms of history compared to everything else, which is kind of like usually when you learn about like history, natural history, you kind of go from Big Bang, and then you go to space and you do all the space stuff of like planets forming, things like that. That's the next thing that you learn after the Big Bang. And then you're like, okay, beginning of life on Earth. And then you learn about like, stuff in the ocean. And then you usually think about, you're like, well, plants are usually like pretty low in the food chain. So like plants came first and then like animals and things like that. And then you're like, well, it must be all plants before all animals. But no, that's not the case. And it goes to show that like multiple things are concurrent. They're happening at the same time. So just because we're in the unit about space doesn't mean that there's not like animal things happening down on planet Earth.
Yeah, that's wild to me.
Which I always found, like, when I was doing, history in school, you usually learn things by like periods or eras and stuff, which does make it easier to understand and digest, especially as a younger child. But I was always like, then you learn things like Anne Frank and Martin Luther King Jr. were born in the same year, and you're like, whoa.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy.
These are two different areas of history. So you're like, oh yeah, like stars are like pretty old and they came first, and we think that they also, I think we like to think, or we don't like to think of, but we often think of a lot of things that exist now as being static. Like, we're just like, oh, like the stars are like, they're there. They live so long, they're basically the same all the time. But no, they're being born and they're dying and they're, all the time, and animals are doing the same thing. So it's a continuous process. It's never a stasis. We've never arrived. We're always continuing. But so I was like, this can't be real, that sharks are older than Saturn's rings. But they are. And so now I get to inflict that on people that I meet all the time. And it's a wonderful fun fact, and I love to do it.
That's crazy.
Isn't it?
Something I've heard Hank Green say, which kind of blew my mind to think about, is that life doesn't take up a lot of space. Like, it's just kind of this thin layer around the Earth, which is itself very small. But compared to, it takes up a lot of time. So like life's been around for like 3 billion years. That's about a quarter of the time the universe has existed just on Earth. That's not counting on some other planet we don't know about. So it's pretty wild how long lasting it is, even though it's kind of a small thing. When you look up at space and you're like, that's bigger than the mind can comprehend. Turns out it's also older than you can comprehend. It's not just big, it's too old.
Yeah, and even if you think about, in comparison to the universe, the thin layer that life is on Earth, how diverse that layer is insane. Like, because, life is, in the oceans and, mainly on kind of like, just in like the crust of the Earth, like not even the majority of the mass of the Earth, because majority of the mass of the Earth is hot rock. Like, there's such a minute, both spatially and like mass-wise, such a minute part of the Earth is the biome, or not the biome, the biomass, and like the biosphere, and or like the biotic, factors and things like that.
Right.
And yet it's still so crazy and diverse, and we're still learning more about it all the time. And I'm like, well, if that's so diverse of like this tiny little corner, this tiny little sliver, this tiny little layer, like what else could be that crazy and that diverse and like that we don't know about? Just like off in the rest of like the universe and space. And that's why I'm like, we need to know more.
I want to go to Europa.
I thought you were just going to say Europe, and I was like, you can do that.
They got planes now.
They got planes, trains, and automobiles. This is perfectly... You're going to love what I tell you about ships. This is going to blow your mind. I would like to go to Io for obvious reasons, but...
That's true. That would be... I don't want to go to Io because it sounds terrible, but I appreciate your name.
I just, like... How fun. Like, what a great postcard that would be. Wish you were here.
I don't. It's like really hot or cold there or something. I think it's terrible, but yeah.
The most volcanically active body in the solar system? I'm gonna look up... Hold on. Live. Okay, I just looked up how old the moon Io is, and it's 4.5 billion years old.
Dope. The same age as everything else.
So, perpetually transforming, so the surface is only about 1 million years old, while the moon itself is around 4.5 billion years old. So, put some respect on that. Respect your elders.
I do. I do.
So yeah, that was my crazy fact check, and just like a fun thing to share. And it involves, I mean, what's not to love? It's got plants, it's got animals, it's got space, it's got time, it's got history. I mean,
it's got everything, basically.
It's got everything.
Well, that's our show. Thanks for listening. If you want to support the show, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/wildgreenmemes. That's memes with an M. Until next time, I'm Rhett.
I'm Io.
And happy Year of the Raccoon.
Bye!